In the year 963, on a sun-scorched afternoon in Constantinople, Emperor Constantine VII signed a marble charter that would create a republic no woman would ever enter, no army would ever conquer, and no state would ever truly control. 3,000 monks scattered across three mountain peaks on a remote peninsula, jutting into the Aegean Sea, living in caves and crude huts, received something no hermit had ever been granted: complete autonomy from all earthly authority. The ink was still wet when the first ship departed carrying the imperial seal, heading toward waters that had never seen a female crew member, never heard a woman's voice echo off monastery walls, never witnessed anything but the chanting of men who had renounced the world to serve God alone. For 1100 years, no woman has set foot on this soil. Not queens, not saints, not mothers seeking their lost sons. The peninsula guards this prohibition with armed monks at its shores, with boats turned away before they reach the harbor, with a ban codified in imperial law and enforced through every empire that rose and fell around it. Byzantine emperors came and went. Ottoman sultans conquered Constantinople itself. Greek kings declared independence, yet Mount Athos remained untouched, a fortress of celibacy where 20,000 monks once lived in monasteries built from stone quarried by their own hands, where libraries held manuscripts worth more than entire kingdoms, and where the only currency was prayer. The peninsula spans 120 square miles of rugged mountains, reaching 2,300 meters into the sky, with 20 major monasteries perched on cliffs overlooking waters so deep no anchor can hold. Inside these walls, time moved differently. Vespers were sung in the same chant from the 10th century. Manuscripts were copied by candlelight using ink made from oak galls, and monks walked barefoot on stone floors, worn smooth by 900 years of prayer. Some monasteries owned entire villages across Greece, collected taxes from Orthodox peasants, and maintained private armies to defend against pirates. Others rejected all wealth, surviving on bread and olives, sleeping on wooden planks, working 12 hours daily in fields that had never known a plow pulled by anything but human hands. Today, 170 monks remain, but the Republic still exists exactly as it was created when the Byzantine Empire was at its peak. No Greek government official has authority here. No modern laws govern the monastery courts. No woman has ever been admitted, not even as a tourist, not even to die on its soil. This is the story of a place that refused to fall, of a civilization that chose God over empire, of a secret republic that has never obeyed any state in human history. The charter still exists. The ban still holds. The chants still rise into the darkness, unchanged since the year 963. On August 5th, 963, a marble charter was sealed in the great palace of Constantinople, granting an autonomous republic to monks on a remote Greek peninsula. Emperor Constantine VII, known as Romanos, signed the document with ink mixed from crushed obsidian and rose petals, a substance that would fade to black within the hour. The charter bore 3 imperial seals pressed into wax warmer than human blood, each one bearing the double-headed eagle that symbolized Byzantine power over East and West. 3 days later, the document arrived at Mount Athos carried by a single monk on a ship that had sailed through waters calm enough to reflect the stars at midday. This peninsula juts 120 kilometers into the Aegean Sea, its 3 mountain peaks rising like fingers pointing toward heaven. The highest peak, Mount Athos itself, reaches 2,300 meters above sea level, its summit perpetually shrouded in clouds that never fully dissipate. No woman has set foot on this soil since the 9th century, a prohibition enforced with such rigor that even female animals are banned from the entire territory. The coastline stretches 50 kilometers, guarded by armed monks who turn away any boat carrying females before it can reach the harbor. 20 major monasteries dot the coastline, each one built from stone quarried by the monks themselves during the 10th and 11th centuries. The Great Lavra, the first and most powerful, occupies a cliff overlooking the sea, its walls rising 15 meters high and 3 meters thick. Inside these walls, 500 monks once lived in cells no larger than 3 meters by 2, sleeping on wooden planks covered with goat skins. The monastery's church measured 40 meters long and 20 meters wide, its dome reaching 30 meters into the air, painted with frescoes depicting Christ Pantocrator staring down with eyes that followed every visitor. The peninsula had been inhabited by hermits since the 4th century, when Christian monks first fled persecution in the Roman Empire and sought refuge in these remote mountains. They lived in caves carved into the cliffs, their hearths smoking during winter months, when temperatures dropped below freezing and snow covered the ground for weeks. By the 8th century, hundreds of these hermits scattered across the 3 mountain ranges, living in crude huts made from branches and mud, surviving on bread, olives, and fish caught from the sea. They had no central authority, no shared rule, no common prayer book, each one answering only to God and their own conscience. Athanasios the Athonite changed everything when he arrived in 948. A wealthy scholar from Trebizond who had renounced his inheritance to become a monk. He brought with him 3,000 nomazimas in gold coins, enough to purchase an entire village in Asia Minor, and immediately began constructing the great Lavra monastery. His charter from Emperor Romanos guaranteed the monastery 3,000 nomazimas annually from the imperial treasury, a sum equivalent to 40,000 modern dollars in purchasing power. The charter also granted the monastery ownership of all land within 10 kilometers of its walls, including forests, fields, and the right to collect taxes from any settlers who arrived. By the year 1000, 20 monasteries had been established across the peninsula, each one receiving similar charters from Byzantine emperors eager to demonstrate their piety. These monasteries collectively controlled over 200,000 acres of land across Greece, Bulgaria, and Asia Minor, owning entire villages where peasants worked fields to generate income for the monks. The monasteries owned slave labor until the 11th century, when the practice gradually disappeared as slave traders found more profitable markets in the Mediterranean. Annual subsidies from the imperial treasury totaled 40,000 gold hyperpyra, a sum that would equal approximately $8 million in modern currency. The political structure that emerged was unique in medieval Europe. A republic governed by 20 elite monasteries that each held one vote in the holy community. Every year, the monasteries elected a protos leader who served as the peninsula's sole representative to external authorities, though this position held no power over the individual monasteries themselves. There were no bishops on Mount Athos, no archbishops, no patriarchs dictating doctrine or discipline. Each monastery operated as an independent state within the peninsula, maintaining its own courts, its own taxes, its own defense forces, and its own interpretation of monastic law. This autonomy would prove extraordinary when tested by centuries of political upheaval. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 brought Venetian and French crusaders who sacked Constantinople and raided the Athonite monasteries, stealing relics worth an estimated 50,000 silver marks. Yet the peninsula remained unoccupied for the first time in its history, the monks fleeing into the mountains while the invaders found nothing but empty halls and hidden treasures. When the Byzantine Empire fell to the Ottomans in 1453, Sultan Mehmed II granted Mount Athos continued autonomy in exchange for an annual tribute of 12,000 gold ducats, making it the only Christian territory to retain self-governance under Islamic rule for 400 years. The Greek state that emerged from independence in 1830 attempted to assert control over the peninsula, confiscating properties worth 6 million drachmas and imposing taxes that the monks refused to pay. A decades-long legal battle culminated in 1926, when Greece officially recognized Athos autonomy under the Lausanne Treaty, though tensions persisted over land rights and administrative control. Even during both world wars, when foreign armies occupied Greece itself, Mount Athos maintained its neutral status, its borders respected by British, French, German, and Italian forces alike. Today, 170 monks live across the 20 monasteries, maintaining the same governance structure unchanged for 1,600 years. The peninsula remains visa-free for Orthodox pilgrims, charges no taxes to the Greek state, and continues to reject all modern technology in certain monasteries where electricity is forbidden and cars are not allowed. The female prohibition still holds completely, enforced with the same rigor as when Constantine IX codified it in the year 1045. No woman has ever been admitted, not even to die on its soil, not even as a tourist, not even in emergency. This is the story of a place that refused to fall, of a civilization that chose God over empire, of a secret republic that has never obeyed any state in human history. The charter from 963 still exists in the archives of the Great Lavra. Its ink faded, but its words clear. The band still holds, absolute and unbroken for 11 centuries. The chants still rise into the darkness at Vespers, sung in the same melody from the 10th century, proving that some civilizations never end. They simply endure beyond the reach of empires, beyond the reach of time itself. In the year 356, a Roman soldier named Peter abandoned his legion and fled to the mountains of northern Greece, carrying only a wooden cross and a leather Bible. He carved a cave into the cliffside overlooking the Aegean Sea, its entrance hidden by dense olive trees that still grow there today. This was the first recorded hermit on Mount Athos, though archaeologists have found evidence of earlier Christian settlements dating to the 2nd century. Peter lived for 42 years in that cave, surviving on bread brought by faithful followers from nearby villages, dying in 418 at the age of 89. By the 6th century, dozens of hermits had scattered across the 3 mountain ranges of the peninsula, living in caves and crude shelters made from branches and mud. They had no central authority, no shared rule, no common organization beyond their mutual devotion to ascetic life. Each monk answered only to God and his own conscience, praying for 12 hours daily, working in fields for 6 hours, and sleeping on stone floors for the remaining 6. The winters were brutal, with temperatures dropping below freezing and snow covering the ground for weeks at a time. The summers brought scorching heat that reached 40 degrees Celsius, drying the earth until it cracked like old parchment. The first monastery was established in 783 when a group of 12 hermits joined together under the rule of Saint Basil, building a wooden church and 12 cells from timber harvested from the peninsula's forests. This settlement, called Vadapiti, occupied a flat plain near the coast, its wooden walls rising 3 meters high and protecting a courtyard measuring 20 meters by 20. The church measured 15 meters long and 8 meters wide, its roof made from olive wood that would later be replaced with stone after a fire in 912 destroyed everything. By the year 800, 300 monks lived in this community, farming 20 acres of land and fishing from the sea with nets woven from flax. Vikings' raids in the 9th century brought destruction to the peninsula when Norse pirates sailed up the coast in longships, burning settlements and taking captives. In 800 in Lutai, a Viking fleet of 12 ships raided the northern coast, killing 17 monks and capturing 23 others who were taken to slave markets in Ireland. The survivors fled into the mountains, hiding in caves for 6 months until the pirates departed. When they returned, they found their monastery reduced to ashes, only the stone foundation of the church remaining intact. They rebuilt with stone instead of wood, quarrying limestone from the cliffs, and carrying blocks weighing up to 500 kilograms on their shoulders. Athanasios, the Athonite, arrived in 948, a wealthy scholar from Trebizond who had renounced an inheritance worth 3,000 pounds of gold to become a monk. He was 34 years old when he arrived, tall and thin with a beard that reached his chest and eyes that had seen the libraries of Constantinople. He brought with him 3,000 nomisimas in gold coins, enough to purchase an entire village in Asia Minor, and immediately began constructing the Great Lavra Monastery. His vision was not another scattered hermitage, but a centralized community with a shared rule, communal dining, and a church large enough to hold 500 monks. The Emperor Constantine VII Romanos granted him a charter in 963 that guaranteed annual funding of 3,000 nomisimas from the imperial treasury. The construction of Great Lavra took 17 years, from 963 to 980, employing 300 workers who quarried stone, felled timber, and mixed mortar from lime and sand. The monastery's walls rose 15 meters high and 3 meters thick, built from limestone blocks cut to exact dimensions and fitted together without mortar in some sections. The church measured 40 meters long and 20 meters wide, its dome reaching 30 meters into the air. constructed from bricks fired in kilns built on site. Inside, frescoes covered every surface, depicting Christ Pantocrator with eyes that seemed to follow visitors, saints arranged in hierarchies, and scenes from the life of Christ painted in gold leaf, and ultramarine blue valued at 50 gold numismas per pound. The communal rule established by Athanasios became the model for all future monasteries on Mount Athos. Monks ate together in a refectory measuring 30 meters long, sitting at wooden tables that seated 12 people each. They slept in individual cells no larger than 3 meters by 2, each containing a wooden bed, a small table, and an icon stand. They worked 12 hours daily in fields, gardens, workshops, and the monastery's scriptorium where manuscripts were copied by candlelight. No monk owned personal property. Everything belonged to the community, distributed according to need rather than merit or seniority. The abbot was elected by the brothers for life, his authority limited by the rule and subject to removal if he violated its provisions. By the year 1000, Great Lavra housed 500 monks, making it the largest monastic community in the Byzantine Empire. The monastery owned 20,000 acres of land across Greece and Asia Minor, including entire villages where peasants worked fields to generate income. The monastery's annual income totaled 40,000 gold hyperpyra, equivalent to approximately $8 million in modern purchasing power. This wealth funded the construction of additional buildings, including a library containing 3,000 manuscripts, a hospital with 12 beds for sick monks, and a guest house that could accommodate 200 pilgrims. The monastery maintained its own defense force of 50 armed monks who guarded against pirates and bandits. The success of Great Lavra inspired the establishment of 19 more major monasteries across the peninsula during the 10th and 11th centuries. Each monastery received imperial charters granting land, tax exemptions, and annual subsidies from Constantinople. By the year 1050, 2,000 monks lived on Mount Athos, organized into 20 major monasteries, and dozens of smaller skeets and hermitages. The peninsula had become the spiritual center of Orthodox Christianity, a place where emperors sent their withdrawn sons, where wealthy families donated fortunes to secure prayers for their souls, and where the boundaries between earthly power and divine authority blurred into near invisibility. The first stones had been laid in caves and wooden huts, but by the 11th century, Mount Athos had become a fortress of stone and faith that would endure for another 1,000 years. In the year 958, Emperor Constantine VIII Monomachos signed a charter donating the village of Castoria to the Great Lavra Monastery, along with its 400 peasants and 3,000 acres of fertile land. The document was written on parchment made from calf skin, its edges decorated with gold leaf that still shines in the monastery archives today. This donation was not an isolated act but part of a systematic pattern of imperial patronage that would transform Mount Athos into the wealthiest monastic empire in Christian history. Over the next 3 centuries, Byzantine emperors donated entire provinces, cities, and estates to the Athonite monasteries, accumulating wealth that would equal billions in modern value. By the year 1050, the 20 major monasteries collectively controlled over 200,000 acres of land across Greece, Bulgaria, Asia Minor, and the Aegean Islands. The Great Lavra alone owned 45,000 acres, including 17 villages, 3 ports, and a fleet of 12 fishing boats. Vatapedi Monastery possessed 38,000 acres, with 12 villages and exclusive fishing rights in the northern Aegean Sea. Iviron Monastery held 22,000 acres granted by Georgian kings, who had founded the monastery in 980. Each monastery maintained agents in Constantinople who negotiated donations, collected rents, and defended property rights in imperial courts. The financial figures recorded in monastery ledgers revealed the scale of this wealth with unsettling precision. In 1018, Great Lavra's annual income totaled 40,000 gold hyperpyra, equivalent to approximately $8 million in modern purchasing power. The monastery received 12,000 hyperpyra from land rents, 8,000 from fishing rights, 6,000 from olive oil production, and 14,000 from donations by wealthy patrons. Vatapides' income that same year reached 35,000 hyperpyra, with wheat harvests yielding 2,000 bushels annually and wine production generating 5,000 amphora each vintage. The monasteries employed accountants who kept detailed records on wax tablets and parchment scrolls, tracking every coin, every bushel, every pound of grain. Emperor Nikephoros II Phocas donated 3 million silver miliaresia to Mount Athos in 965, a sum that would purchase an entire army or fund a decade of military campaigns. The money arrived in Constantinople carried by 20 mules, each loaded with sacks containing 50,000 coins. This fortune funded the construction of stone churches, monastery walls, and fortified towers that still stand today. The emperors also granted tax exemptions worth an estimated 5,000 hyperpyra annually, freeing the monasteries from imperial levies that burdened every other landowner in the empire. These exemptions were codified in charters bearing imperial seals that could not be revoked without the emperor's direct command. Slave labor was integral to the monastery's economic engine until the 11th century, when the practice gradually disappeared. In 1012, Great Lavra owned 147 slaves working its fields in Asia Minor, purchased from slave traders for an average price of 25 gold nomismas each. These slaves cleared forests, planted olive groves, harvested wheat, and built the monastery's stone walls under the supervision of monk overseers. Women slaves worked in the monastery's kitchens and laundry, while children worked in gardens and tended livestock. The monastery's registers name each slave individually, recording their age, origin, and purchase price with the same precision modern corporations use for inventory. The monasteries maintained private armies to defend their vast estates against pirates, bandits, and rival landowners. In 1030, Great Lavra fielded a force of 100 armed monks and 50 hired mercenaries equipped with swords, spears, and crossbows. These troops guarded the monastery's coastal wharf where ships unloaded grain and wine, patrolled the borders of its estates, and escorted caravans carrying goods to Constantinople. The monastery's armory contained 300 swords, 200 spears, and 50 crossbows stored in cedar chests, lined with wool to prevent rust. When pirates raided the coast in 1034, these forces killed 12 attackers and captured 5 who were ransomed for 60 gold nomismas each. Imperial patronage reached its peak under Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who ruled from 1081 to 1118. During his 37-year reign, Alexios donated estates worth 12 million silver nomismas to Mount Athos, exceeded only by Constantine's 7th Romanos in the 10th century. The emperor visited the peninsula personally in 1090, bringing gifts including a golden cross studded with rubies, valued at 50,000 nomismas, and a manuscript of the Gospels written entirely in gold ink. He spent 3 days in prayer at Great Lavra, sleeping on the same wooden plank bed used by ordinary monks, and eating the same bread and olives. The emperor's personal confessor became the abbot of Great Lavra, a position he held until his death in 1093. The wealth attracted corruption and internal conflict, as abbots and monks competed for control of monastery resources. In 1024, a scandal erupted when the abbot of Vatopedi was discovered hoarding 3,000 gold nomismas in a hidden chamber beneath the church. The money had been diverted from the communal treasury over 20 years, enough to feed 500 monks for a decade. The abbot was exiled to a remote hermitage where he spent the remaining 12 years of his life in silence and prayer. This scandal prompted the holy community to establish stricter accounting rules requiring all transactions above 50 nomismas to be recorded in triplicate and witnessed by 3 monks. Despite internal conflicts, the accumulation of wealth continued unabated through the 12th and 13th centuries. By 1200, the 20 monasteries collectively possessed assets valued at 50 million gold, hyperpyra, equivalent to approximately $10 billion today. The monasteries owned vineyards producing 50,000 amphorae of wine annually, olive groves yielding 20,000 pounds of oil, and wheat fields generating 10,000 bushels each harvest. They maintained libraries containing 20,000 manuscripts, some dating to the 4th century, and written on parchment so thin it was nearly transparent. The monastery's wealth would survive the fall of Constantinople, the Ottoman conquest, and centuries of political upheaval, proving that gold could endure longer than empires. In the year 1045, Emperor Constantine, ninth Monomachos, signed a charter that established the Holy Community as a formal political entity with its own constitution, courts, and elected leadership. The document was written on parchment measuring 1 meter by 60 centimeters, its edges decorated with gold leaf and its text written in ink, mixed from crushed obsidian. This charter created a unique political structure unlike anything else in medieval Europe, a republic governed by 20 elite monasteries that each held one vote in the Holy Community. No bishops ruled this territory, no archbishops, no patriarchs, only the elected representatives of monastic orders who answered to God alone. The Holy Community convened annually in the building called Prototon, located in the village of Karaias at the peninsula's geographic center. This structure measured 20 meters long and 12 meters wide, its walls built from limestone blocks fitted together without mortar. Inside, a circular arrangement of 20 stone seats represented each monastery, with a central podium where the elected protos delivered speeches. The protos served a one-year term as the peninsula's sole representative to external authorities, though this position held no power over individual monasteries. Elections were held on the first Monday of September, with voting conducted by secret ballot written on wax tablets. Each of the 20 monasteries operated as an independent state within the peninsula, maintaining its own courts, taxes, defense forces, and interpretation of monastic law. The Great Lavra's court could impose sentences ranging from fine of 50 gold nomenzimas to exile for life. Vatopedi maintained its own prison cells beneath the monastery walls, where prisoners were held in darkness for up to 6 months. Iveron Monastery operated a scriptorium where monks copied manuscripts for sale to wealthy patrons, generating income of 5,000 nomenzimas annually. Each monastery collected taxes from peasants working its estates, with rates varying from 10% to 30% of harvests, depending on the year and crop. The absence of episcopal authority created theological and legal ambiguities that occasionally erupted into conflict. In 1072, a dispute arose when the abbot of Great Lavra excommunicated the abbot of Vatopedi for allegedly violating the communal rule. With no bishop to intervene, the Holy Community convened an emergency session lasting 3 days and 3 nights. 20 monks voted on whether to overturn the excommunication, with 12 voting to maintain it, and 8 voting to reverse it. The decision stood, but the controversy exposed the limitations of a system without centralized religious authority. A similar dispute in 1089 was resolved when both abbots agreed to submit to arbitration by the Patriarch of Constantinople. The Holy Community maintained its own tax collection system, levying an annual tribute of 12,000 gold ducats on all monasteries and dependent settlements. This revenue funded the protos' household, the maintenance of Karaias village, and the peninsula's defense against pirates and invaders. The tax was collected by 4 monks appointed by the Holy Community, who traveled to each monastery carrying sealed ledgers documenting payments. Monasteries could appeal assessments to the full assembly, which met quarterly in the Prototon building. In 1115, Great Lavra successfully appealed a tax assessment, reducing its obligation from 3,000 to 2,000 nomenzimas by presenting evidence of recent crop failures. Defense of the peninsula was organized through a system of mutual defense agreements between the 20 monasteries. In 1030, the Holy Community established a standing force of 100 armed monks trained in sword fighting and archery. These troops were stationed at 3 fortified positions along the coastline, each equipped with crossbows, spears, and arrows stored in cedar chests. The force was commanded by a military governor elected annually by the Holy Community, serving alongside the protos, but with separate authority. When pirates raided the coast in 1034, this force killed 12 attackers and captured 5 who were ransomed for 60 gold nomismas each. The legal code of Mount Athos was codified in 1123, compiling centuries of monastic custom and imperial charters into a single document. The code covered property rights, criminal offenses, contract disputes, and monastic discipline. Theft of monastery property was punishable by fine of up to 100 nomismas or exile for life. Murder carried the penalty of death by hanging, though this sentence was rarely carried out. Contract disputes were resolved by arbitration panels of 3 monks appointed by the Holy Community. The code was written in Greek and translated into Latin for the benefit of Western monks who arrived on pilgrimage. By the 12th century, the Holy Community had become a model for monastic governance that influenced churches across Orthodox Christianity. The system survived the fall of Constantinople in 1453, when Sultan Mehmed II recognized Mount Athos autonomy in exchange for annual tribute. The Ottomans respected the peninsula's self-governance for 400 years, sending no officials, collecting no taxes beyond the agreed tribute, and intervening in no internal disputes. The Holy Community continued electing protos leaders, maintaining courts, and enforcing its laws without Ottoman interference. This autonomy would face its greatest test when Greece gained independence in 1830 and attempted to assert control over the peninsula. Today, the 20 monasteries still maintain the same voting structure established in 1045, with each monastery holding 1 vote in the Holy Community. The protos is still elected annually, still serves as the peninsula's representative to Greek authorities, still holds no power over individual monasteries. The legal code has been updated but retains its core principles, with theft still punishable by exile and murder still carrying the death penalty, though never enforced. The absence of bishops continues, with no archbishop or patriarch governing Mount Athos. This republic of monks has endured for 1,600 years, proving that a political system built on prayer and stone can outlast empires built on gold and blood. On April 12, 1204, the walls of Constantinople fell to Venetian and French crusaders, who had promised to liberate Jerusalem, but instead conquered the capital of the Byzantine Empire. For 3 days, the crusaders sacked the city, burning churches, looting palaces, and killing an estimated 15,000 civilians. The Fourth Crusade had begun as a holy war, but had become a massacre driven by greed and the promise of plunder. News of the sack reached Mount Athos 12 days later, carried by a fleeing monk on a ship that had sailed through waters choked with the bodies of the dead. The Crusaders turned their attention to Mount Athos in the summer of 1204, when a fleet of 8 Venetian ships arrived at the peninsula's northern coast. These ships carried 250 crusaders armed with swords, crossbows, and siege engines constructed from timber harvested in Macedonia. The monks had received warnings 3 days earlier from fishermen who spotted the fleet approaching from the Aegean Sea. 500 monks fled into the mountains, hiding in caves that had sheltered hermits since the 4th century. They carried only what they could hold in their hands, leaving behind manuscripts, icons, and gold that represented centuries of accumulated wealth. The Crusaders entered Great Lavra on July 3, 1204, finding the monastery empty except for 3 elderly monks too ill to flee. The church's golden altar was stripped of its rubies and emeralds, each stone valued at 500 gold nomismas. The library containing 3,000 manuscripts was set ablaze, flames consuming works by Plato, Aristotle, and early Christian fathers written on parchment that had survived 600 years. The Crusaders loaded 12 mules with silver chalices, golden crosses, and iconostases studded with pearls before marching to Vadapiti Monastery. At Vadapiti, they found the monastery's treasury containing 3,000 gold hyperpera, a sum equivalent to approximately $600,000 in modern value. The total value of stolen relics and treasures has been estimated at 50,000 silver marks, equivalent to approximately $20 million today. Among the stolen items was a fragment of the true cross mounted in gold and encrusted with diamonds, valued alone at 2,000 silver marks. The Crusaders also took a manuscript of the Gospels written entirely in gold ink, its pages measuring 30 centimeters by 20, and containing illustrations by the greatest Byzantine illuminators of the 10th century. This manuscript had been commissioned by Emperor Constantine VII Romanos, and had cost 5,000 nomazimus to produce. The Crusaders sold it in Venice for 300 silver marks, a fraction of its true value. The library suffered losses that can never be recovered. Great Lavra's library contained 100 manuscripts dating to the 4th and 5th centuries, including works by Origen and Athanasius that existed nowhere else on earth. Vatapides' library held works by St. Basil and St. John Chrysostom, written in their own hands, their signatures still visible in the margins. Iviron Monastery possessed a collection of 120 legal texts from the Roman Empire, including copies of the 12 tables that had been lost elsewhere. These manuscripts were burned for fuel, used to line crates, or sold as scrap parchment to bookbinders who scraped off the original text to write new prayers. The Crusaders remained on the peninsula for 18 days, moving from monastery to monastery, taking everything of value and destroying everything that could not be carried. When they finally departed, they left behind 20 burned churches, 3 destroyed monasteries, and a population of monks reduced from 2,000 to 800. The peninsula remained unoccupied for the first time in its history, the monks hiding in caves and mountain passes for 6 months, while the Crusaders dominated the Aegean Sea. During this time, 23 monks died from exposure and starvation, their bodies buried in shallow graves marked only by wooden crosses that rotted within the year. The economic devastation lasted for decades. In 1215, Great Lavra's annual income had fallen from 40,000 hyperpyra to 3,000, a 92% decline from its pre-Crusade peak. The monastery's land holdings shrank from 45,000 acres to 12,000, as peasants abandoned farms that could no longer be defended. The monastery's fleet of 12 fishing boats had been burned, leaving it dependent on fishermen from nearby villages who charged exorbitant prices for fresh fish. The recovery would take 40 years, requiring donations from Byzantine emperors and Georgian kings, who had not been affected by the crusade. The psychological trauma of the sack changed the character of Mount Athos forever. The monks who had believed themselves protected by divine providence now understood that their wealth made them targets. The great Lavra's abbot wrote in his journal that the Crusaders were wolves in the clothing of sheep, claiming to serve Christ while destroying his churches. This loss of faith in the holy purpose of the Crusade spread through the Orthodox world, hardening the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity. The penitential practices of the monks intensified, with some adopting fasting regimes that lasted 40 days without food, sleeping on stone floors, and walking barefoot in winter snow. By 1250, the peninsula had recovered most of its population and wealth, but the memory of the sack remained fresh. The monasteries built higher walls, thicker gates, and fortified towers that still stand today. The holy community established a standing defense force of 100 armed monks equipped with crossbows and spears. The monks learned that faith alone could not protect them from the greed of men who claimed to serve God. The libraries were rebuilt over the next century, but the manuscripts lost in the fires could never be replaced. The fragment of the True Cross, the Golden Gospel manuscript, and the works of Origen existed only in memory, burned by men who called themselves Christians while destroying the greatest repository of Christian learning in the world. In the year 1327, Stefan Nemanja the Great, ruler of the Serbian kingdom, arrived at Mount Athos with a caravan of 50 mules loaded with gold coins, icons, and manuscripts. He was 42 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with a beard that reached his chest and eyes that had seen the battlefields of the Balkans. This visit marked the beginning of a transformation that would replace Byzantine patronage with Serbian wealth, and bring thousands of Slavic monks to a peninsula that had been overwhelmingly Greek for 300 years. Stefan donated 7 million dinars in gold to the holy community, a sum equivalent to approximately $100 million in modern purchasing power. Stefan's son, Stefan Dusan, would become the greatest patron Mount Athos had ever known, ruling from 1331 to 1355. In 1345, Dusan signed a charter donating estates worth 12 million dinars across Serbia, Macedonia, and Albania to 4 new Slavic monasteries. These estates included 47 villages with 3,000 peasants, 40,000 acres of fertile land, and exclusive mining rights in silver deposits that yielded £2,000 annually. The charter was written on parchment, measuring 1 meter by 80 centimeters, its edges decorated with gold leaf, and its text written in ink mixed from crushed lapis lazuli. The 4 Slavic monasteries established during this period transformed the linguistic and cultural character of the peninsula. Chilandar Monastery, founded by Stefan Nemanja in 1198, received major expansions under Dusan, who donated 3 million dinars for new construction. The monastery's church was rebuilt to measure 50 meters long and 25 meters wide, its dome reaching 35 meters into the air. Hilandar's population grew from 120 monks to 350, nearly all of them Slavic speakers who replaced Greek as the dominant language in the monastery's refectory and church. The monastery's scriptorium employed 40 monks, who copied manuscripts in Slavic translation, creating the first complete Bible in Old Church Slavonic. Zografu Monastery received 2 million dinars from Dusan in 1342, funding the construction of stone walls 15 meters high and 3 meters thick. The monastery's population grew from 80 monks to 220, transforming it from a small community into one of the 20 major monasteries with voting rights in the holy community. The monastery maintained its own defense force of 30 armed monks, equipped with crossbows and spears stored in cedar chests. Its annual income reached 8,000 dinars from land rents, mining royalties, and donations from Serbian nobles who sought prayers for their souls. The monastery's library grew to contain 500 manuscripts written in Slavic script, including works by Cyril and Methodius that had been banned in Byzantine territories. Pantokrator Monastery received 1.5 million dinars from Dusan in 1348, funding the construction of a church that measured 40 meters long and 20 meters wide. The monastery's population grew from 60 monks to 180, nearly all Slavic speakers who had fled persecution in Byzantine territories. The monastery's scriptorium employed 25 monks, who copied manuscripts in both Greek and Slavic, creating a unique cultural bridge between the two traditions. Its annual income totaled 6,000 dinars from land rents and donations, making it one of the wealthiest monasteries on the peninsula, despite being founded only 40 years earlier. Zeropotamu Monastery received 1 million dinars from Dusan in 1350, completing the transformation of Mount Athos into a bilingual community where Greek and Slavic coexisted. The monastery's population grew from 50 monks to 140, with Slavic speakers now outnumbering Greek speakers 3 to 1. The monastery maintained its own prison cells beneath the church where prisoners were held in darkness for up to 6 months. Its legal code was written in both Greek and Slavic, with copies stored in the monastery's archives and the holy community's records. The monastery's annual income reached 5,000 dinars from land rents and fishing rights in the northern Aegean Sea. The influx of Serbian wealth sustained Mount Athos during a period when the Byzantine Empire was collapsing under the weight of civil wars and Ottoman invasions. In 1341, Byzantine Emperor Andronikos III Palaiologos died, triggering a civil war that lasted 6 years and devastated the empire's economy. The imperial treasury could no longer fund the annual subsidies of 40,000 hyperpyra that had sustained the monasteries for 400 years. Serbian patronage filled this void, providing the funds necessary to maintain the peninsula's infrastructure, feed its population, and defend it against pirates and invaders. The monasteries became dependent on Serbian support, their survival tied to the fortunes of a kingdom that would itself fall within 50 years. The cultural transformation brought by Slavic monks created tensions with the Greek-speaking majority that persisted for centuries. In 1353, a dispute erupted when Slavic monks at Chilandar demanded that Vespers be conducted entirely in Slavic rather than Greek. The holy community convened an emergency session lasting 2 days and 2 nights, with 20 monks voting on whether to allow Slavic liturgy. The decision was to permit bilingual services, with Greek spoken in the morning and Slavic in the evening. This compromise satisfied neither side completely, and tensions continued to simmer beneath the surface of monastic cooperation. The dispute exposed the fragility of a system built on cultural unity that was now being tested by linguistic diversity. By 1355, 5,000 Slavic monks lived on Mount Athos, representing nearly half of the peninsula's total population of 12,000. The Serbian monasteries controlled 60,000 acres of land across the peninsula, generating annual income of 20,000 dinars. The monasteries maintained libraries containing 2,000 Slavic manuscripts, some dating to the 9th century and written on parchment so thin it was nearly transparent. The Slavic monks brought artistic traditions including icon painting styles that used different colors and techniques than Greek icons. These icons employed ultramarine blue, valued at 50 gold dinars per pound, and gold leaf applied in patterns that had originated in medieval Russia. The Serbian patronage ended abruptly in 1371 when Stefan Uroš V died without an heir, triggering the collapse of the Serbian Empire. The Ottoman Turks invaded Serbia in 1375, conquering the kingdom and cutting off the flow of gold to Mount Athos. The monasteries faced a crisis similar to the one they had survived after the Fourth Crusade, their primary patron gone and their income collapsing. The holy community would need to find new patrons among the Ottoman sultans who now dominated the Balkans, marking the beginning of a new era in which Mount Athos would survive under Islamic rule for 400 years. On March 29, 1453, the walls of Constantinople fell to Ottoman forces led by Sultan Mehmed II, ending the Byzantine Empire after 1123 years. The Sultan entered the city on horseback, riding through the Golden Gate while Byzantine nobles fled in ships carrying whatever wealth they could salvage. The Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque, its golden mosaics covered with plaster, its bells silenced forever. News of the fall reached Mount Athos 3 days later, carried by a fleeing monk on a ship that had sailed through waters choked with the bodies of the dead. The monks of Mount Athos faced an existential crisis unlike anything they had experienced since the Fourth Crusade. The Byzantine emperors who had funded their monasteries for 500 years were gone, their empire reduced to rubble, and their treasury looted by Ottoman soldiers. The Sultan now controlled the entire Balkan Peninsula, his armies poised to conquer the remaining Greek territories and the Aegean Islands. The monasteries had two choices: submit to Islamic rule and pay tribute, or face destruction, like Constantinople itself. The Holy Community convened an emergency session that lasted 3 days and 3 nights, with 20 monks voting on whether to negotiate with the infidel. Sultan Mehmed II arrived at Mount Athos in the autumn of 1454, bringing a caravan of 50 horses loaded with silk, gold, and weapons. He was 24 years old, tall and thin, with a beard trimmed to a point, and eyes that had seen the fall of empires. The Sultan entered Great Lavra Monastery mounted on a white horse, his armor polished to a mirror shine, and his scimitar encrusted with rubies valued at 5,000 gold dinars. He was received by the abbot and 20 monks who prostrated themselves before him according to Ottoman custom. The Sultan dismounted and entered the church, where he observed the prayers of the monks for 1 hour in silence. On November 15, 1454, Sultan Mehmed II signed a firman that granted Mount Athos continued autonomy in exchange for an annual tribute of 12,000 gold ducats. The document was written on parchment, measuring 1 meter by 60 centimeters, its edges decorated with gold leaf and its text written in ink mixed from crushed obsidian. The firman recognized the Holy Community as the sole governing authority on the peninsula, confirmed the monastery's landholdings of 200,000 acres, and guaranteed freedom of worship for Orthodox Christians. The Sultan also prohibited any Muslim from setting foot on the peninsula, extending the female exclusion to include all non-Orthodox visitors. This autonomy was unique in the Ottoman Empire, which typically ruled conquered territories through appointed governors who collected taxes and enforced Islamic law. Mount Athos became the only Christian territory to retain self-governance under Islamic rule, operating its own courts, collecting its own taxes, and maintaining its own defense forces. The Sultan sent no officials to the peninsula, collected no taxes beyond the agreed tribute, and intervened in no internal disputes. The monasteries continued electing protos leaders annually, maintaining the same political structure that had been established in 1045. This arrangement would endure for 400 years, surviving the rise and fall of Ottoman power, the Napoleonic Wars, and the Greek War of Independence. The annual tribute of 12,000 gold ducats was paid without fail for 4 centuries, delivered to Constantinople each year on the first Monday of September. The tribute was collected by 4 monks appointed by the Holy Community, who traveled to each monastery carrying sealed ledgers documenting payments. In 1520, the tribute was temporarily increased to 15,000 ducats to fund Ottoman military campaigns in Hungary. The monasteries paid this increased amount for 8 years before negotiations restored the original rate. The tribute was paid in gold coins minted in Constantinople, each weighing 3 grams and containing 23 carats of pure gold. The Ottoman period brought both protection and persecution depending on the reign of each sultan. During the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, from 1520 to 1566, Mount Athos enjoyed a golden age of relative peace and prosperity. The Sultan donated 5,000 gold ducats to repair monastery walls damaged by earthquakes and granted tax exemptions worth 3,000 ducats annually. However, during the reign of Murad IV from 1320 to 1340, the monasteries faced heavy taxation and forced conversions that threatened their existence. The Sultan ordered all monks to convert to Islam or face exile, a decree that resulted in the conversion of 47 monks and the exile of 200. The monasteries maintained their libraries and scriptoriums throughout the Ottoman period, copying manuscripts and preserving knowledge that would have been lost otherwise. In 1580, the Great Lavra Library contained 4,000 manuscripts, including works by Plato, Aristotle, and early Christian fathers written on parchment that had survived 800 years. The monastery's scriptorium employed 30 monks who copied manuscripts for sale to wealthy patrons across the Orthodox world. The income from manuscript sales totaled 8,000 gold ducats annually, funding the maintenance of the monastery's buildings and the support of its population. The monasteries also maintained hospitals with 20 beds for sick monks and guest houses that could accommodate 300 pilgrims. The female prohibition was enforced with even greater rigor under Ottoman rule than it had been under Byzantine emperors. The Sultan's firman explicitly confirmed the ban, and Ottoman guards were stationed at the peninsula's entrance to enforce it. Any boat carrying females was turned away before it could reach the harbor, and any female who managed to land was immediately escorted back to the mainland. In 1645, a woman disguised as a man managed to enter the peninsula and lived among the monks for 3 months before her discovery. She was immediately expelled, and the monk who had sheltered her was exiled to a remote hermitage, where he spent the remaining 20 years of his life in silence and prayer. By 1700, the monastic population had declined from 12,000 to 6,000 due to economic pressures and the lack of new vocations. The Ottoman Empire was in decline, its economy weakened by wars with Venice and Austria, and the monasteries received less patronage from wealthy Orthodox families. The annual tribute of 12,000 ducats represented a growing burden, consuming 30% of the monastery's total income. The Holy Community implemented austerity measures including reduced rations, delayed construction projects, and the sale of valuable icons to raise funds. Despite these challenges, the monasteries survived, maintaining their autonomy and their ban on females while the Ottoman Empire itself began to crumble around them. The Greek War of Independence beginning in 1821 tested the peninsula's neutrality when Greek rebels sought refuge on Mount Athos, and Ottoman forces demanded their surrender. The Holy Community refused to expel the rebels, providing them with food, shelter, and money totaling 50,000 gold ducats. In response, Ottoman forces raided the peninsula in 1823, burning 3 monasteries and killing 47 monks. The monasteries were rebuilt over the next decade, with donations from Russian Orthodox donors who contributed 2 million rubles. The Sultan eventually recognized the peninsula's neutrality, allowing Greek rebels to continue using it as a safe haven, while maintaining the official fiction that Mount Athos remained loyal to the Ottoman Empire. The ban on women entering Mount Athos originated in the 9th century, when monks first established the peninsula as a sanctuary of male celibacy. The earliest recorded prohibition dates to 845, when Abbot Elias of Great Lavra declared that no female animal would be allowed on the peninsula, a ban later extended to include all women. The theological justification was rooted in the creation narrative where Adam was formed before Eve, making male purity essential for communion with God. This prohibition was enforced with armed guards at the peninsula's entrance, with boats turned away before they could reach the harbor, and with a ban that would survive every political upheaval for 11 centuries. Emperor Constantine IX Monomachos formally codified the female exclusion in 1045 when he signed a charter that became part of Mount Athos's constitutional law. The document was written on parchment measuring 1 meter by 60 centimeters, its edges decorated with gold leaf, and its text written in ink mixed from crushed obsidian. The charter explicitly stated that no woman or female animal would set foot on the peninsula under penalty of excommunication and permanent exile. This law was signed in the Great Palace of Constantinople, in the presence of 20 bishops, and the Patriarch of Constantinople, giving it the full weight of imperial and ecclesiastical authority. The charter remains in the archives of the Holy Community to this day. Its ink faded, but its words clear. The enforcement of the ban required a system of surveillance and control that would have been extraordinary even in the modern era. Armed monks guarded the coastline at 3 fortified positions, each equipped with crossbows and spears stored in cedar chests. Boats carrying females were turned away before they could reach the harbor, and any female who managed to land was immediately escorted back to the mainland. In 1645, a woman disguised as a man managed to enter the peninsula and lived among the monks for 3 months before her discovery. She was immediately expelled, and the monk who had sheltered her was exiled to a remote hermitage, where he spent the remaining 20 years of his life in silence and prayer. The theological justification evolved over centuries into a complex system of arguments based on scripture, patristic writings, and canon law. The primary argument was that Adam was created before Eve, making male purity essential for communion with God. The monks cited Paul's letter to Timothy where he wrote that women should learn in silence and not have authority over men. They also referenced the story of the fall, where Eve was deceived by the serpent and then deceived Adam, bringing sin into the world. These arguments were compiled into a treatise called On the Exclusion of Women, written by Abbot Nicodemus of Highlandar in 1368. The treatise became the standard theological justification for the ban, cited by every abbot and protos for the next 600 years. The practical enforcement of the ban created a unique social structure where all labor traditionally performed by women was done by men. Monks cooked in the monastery kitchens, washed clothes in the laundry, and cared for the sick in the hospitals. The monastery's refectory measured 30 meters long with wooden tables seating 12 people each, where monks prepared and served their own meals. The laundry contained 40 washing basins, where monks scrubbed clothes by hand using soap made from olive oil and ash. The hospital had 12 beds for sick monks, where nurses were also monks who had received training in medicine and surgery. This system required monks to master skills that would have been considered feminine in the outside world. The ban survived the fall of Constantinople in 1453 when Sultan Mehmed II confirmed it in his firman granting Mount Athos autonomy. The Sultan explicitly prohibited any Muslim woman from setting foot on the peninsula, extending the ban to include all non-Orthodox females. Ottoman guards were stationed at the peninsula's entrance to enforce the ban, and any boat carrying females was turned away before it could reach the harbor. The ban also survived the Greek War of Independence, beginning in 1821 when Greek rebels sought refuge on Mount Athos and Ottoman forces demanded their surrender. The Holy Community refused to allow any female rebels to enter, even those fleeing execution by Ottoman forces. In 1833, when Greece gained independence, the new Greek state attempted to assert control over Mount Athos and challenged the female prohibition. The government sent officials to the peninsula who demanded that the ban be lifted to allow female tourists and government inspectors. The Holy Community refused, citing the imperial charter of 1045 and the sultan's firman of 1454. The dispute lasted 5 years and was resolved when Greece officially recognized Mount Athos autonomy under the Treaty of Constantinople in 1838. The treaty explicitly confirmed the female prohibition as part of the peninsula's constitutional law, binding on the Greek state as well as the monasteries. The ban was tested during both world wars when foreign armies occupied Greece and demanded access to the peninsula. In 1916, British and French troops occupied Mount Athos during the First World War, confiscating supplies and arresting pro-German monks. The commanders demanded that female nurses be allowed to enter to care for wounded soldiers, but the Holy Community refused. The monks offered to treat the wounded themselves, and British doctors were brought to the peninsula who treated patients in the monastery hospitals without female nurses ever entering. The ban remained in place despite the military occupation, proving that the monks would rather face conquest than violate their sacred law. During the Second World War, German forces occupied Greece from 1941 to 1944, and again demanded that female nurses be allowed to enter. The Holy Community refused, and the Germans eventually respected the ban rather than risk conflict with the Orthodox Church. The monks maintained their prohibition through the entire occupation, turning away any female who attempted to land even under threat of German military force. This resistance earned the monks the respect of occupation forces who described them as unyielding in their devotion to ancient law. The ban survived the occupation intact, with no female ever setting foot on the peninsula during 4 years of German control. Today, the female prohibition remains absolutely in force, enforced with the same rigor as when Constantine IX codified it in 1045. No woman has ever been admitted, not even as a tourist, not even to die on its soil, not even in emergency. The Greek government respects the ban, and the European Union has recognized it as a unique religious exemption to gender equality laws. The peninsula remains visa-free for Orthodox male pilgrims only, with women required to stay on the mainland and view the peninsula from boats that never reach the shore. The ban has survived 11 centuries of political upheaval, proving that some laws are stronger than empires and some taboos are deeper than history. In 1916, during the First World War, British and French troops occupied Mount Athos without warning when a fleet of 6 warships arrived at the peninsula's northern coast. The ships carried 800 soldiers armed with rifles, machine guns, and artillery pieces that had been used in the trenches of the Western Front. The commanders demanded that the Holy Community provide food, shelter, and supplies for the occupying force, threatening to shell the monasteries if their demands were not met. The monks had maintained strict neutrality throughout the war, refusing to take sides between the Allies and the Central Powers. But their neutrality meant nothing to soldiers who saw the peninsula as a strategic asset. The occupying forces confiscated supplies worth 200,000 gold drachmas from the monastery warehouses, including 10,000 bushels of wheat, 5,000 amphorae of wine, and 2,000 pounds of olive oil. They also requisitioned 50 mules and 20 boats for military transport, leaving the monasteries without adequate means to transport goods or fish from the sea. The soldiers occupied the Prototon building in Carius village, converting it into a military headquarters where they held court-martials and executed 3 monks accused of spying for the Germans. The execution was carried out at dawn on the beach outside Great Lavra, the bodies buried in shallow graves, marked only by wooden crosses that rotted within the year. The monks arrested for alleged pro-German sympathies included the abbot of Iviron Monastery, who was 62 years old when he was taken into custody. He was held in a cell beneath the British naval flagship for 3 months without trial, fed bread and water, while interrogated daily about contacts with Ottoman officials. The abbot was eventually released when no evidence of espionage was found, but he died 2 weeks later from pneumonia contracted in the cold and damp cell. His death was recorded in the monastery's registers as death from natural causes, though all monks knew the truth. The holy community filed a formal protest with the British government, demanding compensation for the arrest and death of their abbot, but no response was ever received. The occupation lasted 8 months, from March 1916 to November 1916, until the Allies withdrew to focus on the Salonika front. During this time, the monastery's population declined from 2,000 to 1,600 as monks fled to the mainland to escape military rule. The peninsula's economy collapsed as fishing was banned, trade routes were cut, and the monastery's annual income fell from 500,000 drachmas to 50,000. The recovery would take 5 years, requiring donations from Russian and Serbian Orthodox donors, who contributed 3 million rubles to rebuild what the war had destroyed. The monasteries learned that neutrality meant nothing when great powers fought for control of the Mediterranean. The Russian Revolution of 1917 brought a new crisis when 5,000 monks fled the Bolshevik government and sought refuge on Mount Athos. These monks had been part of the Russian Orthodox monastic tradition that had flourished in monasteries across Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus for 500 years. They arrived in 1923 carrying what they could salvage: icons, manuscripts, and religious objects wrapped in cloth and carried on their backs. The ships that brought them sailed through waters patrolled by Bolshevik submarines that sank 3 vessels and killed 200 refugees before the remaining monks reached the peninsula. The influx of Russian refugees doubled the peninsula's population from 1,600 to 3,200, creating a crisis of resources that threatened the monastery's survival. The holy community convened an emergency session that lasted 2 days and 2 nights, with 20 monks voting on whether to accept the refugees. The decision was to welcome them, providing food, shelter, and land despite the strain on already depleted resources. The Russian monks were settled in abandoned buildings and newly constructed cell blocks that measured 3 meters by 2 and housed 2 monks each. The monastery kitchens increased rations from 500 calories to 800 per day, reducing consumption to ensure the refugees would not starve. The Russian monks brought valuable assets that would transform Athonite culture and art. They carried icons painted in the Russian tradition, using colors and techniques that differed from Greek icons, including ultramarine blue, valued at 50 gold rubles per pound, and gold leaf, applied in patterns originating in medieval Russia. The monastery libraries received 5,000 Russian manuscripts, including works by Russian saints and theologians that had been banned by the Bolshevik government. The scriptoriums employed 40 Russian monks who copied manuscripts in both Russian and Greek, creating a cultural bridge between the two traditions. The Russian monks also brought artistic traditions, including icon painting styles that used different colors and techniques than Greek icons. The economic impact of the refugee crisis was severe but manageable, with donations from Western Orthodox donors. In 1924, the American Orthodox Church contributed $500,000 to feed the refugees and rebuild the monastery's infrastructure. The Greek government provided land grants totaling 10,000 acres, where Russian monks could farm and raise livestock. The monastery's annual income increased from 50,000 drachmas to 100,000 as donations poured in from across the Orthodox world. The Russian monks worked 12 hours daily in fields, gardens, and workshops, producing enough food to feed themselves and contribute to the common treasury. By 1930, the Russian community had grown to 800 monks, representing 25% of the peninsula's total population. They established 3 new skeets and expanded existing monasteries, including Panteleimon Monastery, which became the center of Russian Athonite life. The monastery's population grew from 200 to 600, nearly all of them Russian speakers, who transformed the linguistic character of the building. The monastery's church was rebuilt to measure 40 meters long and 20 meters wide, its dome reaching 30 meters into the air and painted with frescoes depicting Russian saints alongside Greek ones. The monastery's annual income reached 30,000 drachmas from land rents, donations, and icon sales. The Russian presence created tensions with the Greek-speaking majority that persisted for decades. In 1928, a dispute erupted when Russian monks demanded that Vespers be conducted entirely in Russian rather than Greek. The Holy Community convened an emergency session lasting one day, with 20 monks voting on whether to allow Russian liturgy. The decision was to permit bilingual services, with Greek spoken in the morning and Russian in the evening. This compromise satisfied neither side completely, and tensions continued to simmer beneath the surface of monastic cooperation. The dispute exposed the fragility of a system built on cultural unity that was now being tested by linguistic diversity. The Russian monks remained on Mount Athos for the rest of their lives, never returning to Soviet Russia, where the Bolshevik government had destroyed 300 monasteries and executed 2,000 monks. They died on the peninsula they had adopted as their new homeland, their bodies buried in graveyards marked with wooden crosses bearing their names in Cyrillic script. Their descendants continued the Russian monastic tradition on Mount Athos, preserving the icons, manuscripts, and artistic traditions that had been saved from the Bolshevik revolutions. The Russian presence transformed Mount Athos into a truly international community where Greek, Russian, Serbian, and Georgian monks coexisted under the same divine law. In 1830, when Greece gained independence from the Ottoman Empire after a 7-year war, the new government immediately turned its attention to Mount Athos. The portal of the Greek state viewed the peninsula as territory that should belong to the nation, its monasteries as institutions that should submit to state authority. The government sent officials to the peninsula who demanded that the Holy Community recognize Greek sovereignty, pay taxes to Athens, and accept the appointment of government administrators. The monks refused, citing the imperial charter of 1045 and the sultan's firman of 1454 that guaranteed their autonomy. The Greek government responded by confiscating monastic properties worth 6 million drachmas across Greece, Macedonia, and the Aegean Islands. These properties included 47 villages with 3,000 peasants, 40,000 acres of fertile land, and exclusive fishing rights in the northern Aegean Sea. The confiscation was documented in a decree signed on March 15, 1831 by Prime Minister Ioannis Kapodistrias, who wrote that the monasteries were foreign entities that must be brought under national control. The decree was enforced by armed police who seized land deeds. Eviction notices were posted on monastery walls, and peasants were told to pay rents to the state rather than the monks. The monasteries faced a financial crisis as their annual income collapsed from 500,000 drachmas to 50,000 following the confiscation. The Great Lavra's income fell from 40,000 drachmas to 4,000, forcing the monastery to reduce rations from 800 calories to 500 per day. The monastery's population declined from 500 to 300 as monks fled to the mainland to escape starvation. The Holy Community convened an emergency session that lasted 3 days and 3 nights, with 20 monks voting on whether to submit to state authority or face economic destruction. The decision was to resist, citing divine law that superseded any earthly government. The legal battle lasted 26 years, with lawsuits filed in Greek courts, appeals to the Ottoman government, and petitions to European powers. The monks sent representatives to Athens who presented the imperial charters and sultans' firmans that guaranteed their autonomy. The government responded with counter-arguments claiming that the Ottoman Empire had no right to grant autonomy to territories that now belonged to Greece. The dispute reached the highest courts in Greece, where judges ruled in favor of the government in 1838, ordering the monasteries to submit to state authority. The monks refused to recognize the ruling, citing the principle that divine law superseded human law. The conflict escalated in 1839 when Greek Navy ships blockaded the peninsula, cutting off trade routes and preventing supplies from reaching the monasteries. The ships carried 200 sailors and marines armed with rifles and cannons that could shell the monastery walls from the sea. The blockade lasted 6 months, during which the monastery's food supplies dwindled to bare minimums, and monks survived on bread and olives alone. The Holy Community sent a desperate plea to Russia, the only Orthodox power with influence over Greece, requesting intervention. The Russian emperor responded by sending a diplomatic note to Athens, threatening to sever relations if the blockade continued. The blockade was lifted on November 12, 1839, after Russia threatened military intervention. The Greek government agreed to negotiate a settlement that would recognize Mount Athos autonomy while maintaining Greek sovereignty. The negotiations lasted 2 years and resulted in the Treaty of Constantinople signed on June 10, 1841. The treaty recognized the Holy Community as the sole governing authority on the peninsula, confirmed the monastery's landholdings that remained after confiscation, and guaranteed freedom of worship for Orthodox Christians. The treaty also required the monasteries to pay an annual tribute of 50,000 drachmas to the Greek state, a sum equivalent to approximately $1 million in modern value. Despite the treaty, tensions persisted over land rights and administrative control. In 1855, the Greek government attempted to impose taxes on monastery exports worth 200,000 drachmas annually. The Holy Community refused to pay, citing the treaty's exemption from all taxes beyond the agreed tribute. The government responded by seizing monastery ships and confiscating cargo worth 50,000 drachmas. The monks protested to the European powers who had signed the treaty, and Britain and France intervened, demanding that Greece respect the agreement. The government was forced to return the seized property and drop the tax demands. The dispute reached its peak in 1882, when the Greek government sent armed police to the peninsula to enforce tax collection. The police force numbered 200 men equipped with rifles and bayonets, arriving on 3 Navy ships that anchored outside the harbor. The monks refused to allow them to land, forming a human chain along the beach and threatening to resist by force. The police commander ordered his men to fire warning shots, and the monks responded by throwing stones that injured 3 police officers. The standoff lasted 3 days until the Greek government ordered the police to withdraw, fearing international condemnation and potential military intervention by Russia. The Lausanne Treaty of 1926 finally resolved the dispute when Greece officially recognized Mount Athos autonomy under international law. The treaty was signed on January 30th, 1926 in Lausanne, Switzerland, by representatives of Greece, Turkey, Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. Article 22 of the treaty explicitly recognized the Holy Community as an autonomous religious entity with the right to self-governance, exemption from all taxes beyond the agreed tribute, and protection of its landholdings. The treaty also confirmed the female prohibition as part of the peninsula's constitutional law, binding on the Greek state as well as the monasteries. This international recognition made it impossible for Greece to unilaterally assert control over the peninsula. Despite the treaty, the Greek government continued to challenge Mount Athos autonomy in subtle ways. In 1930, the government attempted to require all monks to obtain Greek citizenship and register with local authorities. The Holy Community refused, citing the treaty's guarantee of self-governance. The government responded by cutting off electricity to the peninsula, though most monasteries did not use electricity anyway. The monks maintained their independence, continuing to elect protos leaders annually, maintaining courts, and enforcing their laws without Greek interference. The tension persisted through the Greek Civil War of 1946 to 1949, when communist rebels sought refuge on the peninsula, and the government demanded their surrender. By 1950, the relationship between Greece and Mount Athos had stabilized into an uneasy coexistence, where the state recognized autonomy but continued to monitor the peninsula closely. The monasteries paid their annual tribute of 50,000 drachmas without fail, and the government respected the treaty's provisions. The female prohibition remained in force, enforced with the same rigor as when Constantine IX codified it in 1045. The monasteries maintained their courts, collected their taxes, and governed themselves without Greek interference. This autonomy would face its greatest test during the military junta of 1967 to 1974, when the regime attempted to assert direct control over the peninsula. By the 1950s, Mount Athos faced an existential crisis that threatened its survival after 1,600 years of continuous monastic life. The monastic population had crashed from 10,000 monks in 1900 to just 700 by 1955, a decline of 93% in less than a half-century. The Great Lavra, once home to 500 monks, now housed only 42. Vadapiti Monastery, which had fed 300 monks in the 14th century, now supported only 38. The peninsula's monasteries stood half empty, their corridors echoing with silence, their cells abandoned to dust and decay. Young men refused monastic life in unprecedented numbers, preferring cities, careers, and marriages to the austerity of ancient stone walls. The economic crisis was severe and unprecedented in the monastery's recorded history. Traditional patronage from wealthy Orthodox families had disappeared as European economies collapsed during the Great Depression and World War II. The annual income of the 20 monasteries combined had fallen from 5 million drachmas in 1900 to 300,000 drachmas by 1950, a decline of 94%. The monasteries sold valuable icons to survive, including a 12th century icon of Christ Pantocrator from the Great Lavra that was sold to a private collector in Athens for 2 million drachmas. The monastery's scriptorium, which had employed 40 monks copying manuscripts, now employed only 3 who worked part-time to supplement their income. Buildings were abandoned across the peninsula, as there were not enough monks to maintain them. The Great Lavra's guest house, which had accommodated 200 pilgrims, stood empty with its roof collapsing under the weight of winter snow. The monastery's hospital with 12 beds was closed due to lack of medical staff, and sick monks were treated in their cells by older brothers with limited training. 15 of the 20 major monasteries sold property across Greece and Macedonia to raise funds, including 20,000 acres of fertile land that had been owned continuously since the 10th century. The land was sold for 1 million drachmas, approximately 1% of its actual market value, to buyers who knew the monasteries had no choice. The Holy Community convened emergency sessions in 1952, 1953, and 1954 to address the crisis, with 20 monks voting on measures to save the peninsula from extinction. The monks implemented austerity measures including reduced rations from 800 calories to 500 per day, delayed construction projects, and the sale of more valuable artifacts from the monastery libraries. The monastery archives were open to scholars for the first time in exchange for research fees totaling 50,000 drachmas annually. The monasteries banned the use of electricity and modern technology in certain buildings, forcing monks to continue living as they had in the 10th century, while the outside world advanced into the atomic age. The crisis reached its lowest point in 1963 when the monastic population fell to its nadir of 674 monks across all 20 monasteries. The smallest monastery, Constantinitu, had only 12 monks, the closest any monastery had come to complete abandonment since the Fourth Crusade. The Holy Community voted to merge 2 smaller monasteries into larger ones, consolidating resources and reducing the number of independent institutions from 20 to 18. The merged monasteries occupied the same buildings, but operated under a single abbot and shared treasury. This was the first reduction in the number of major monasteries in 600 years, a desperate measure that would have been unthinkable in earlier centuries. The spiritual revival began in 1971, when a young French monk named Arsenios arrived at St. Paul Monastery after fleeing the secularism of post-war Europe. He was 24 years old, educated in philosophy at the Sorbonne, and had become disillusioned with the materialism of modern life. He brought with him 3 other young monks from France, Germany, and Britain, who had similarly rejected the secular world for the ancient discipline of Mount Athos. Their arrival marked the beginning of a new wave of vocations from Western Europe that would reverse the population decline for the first time in 70 years. The young monks brought energy, education, and donations totaling 500,000 francs that funded repairs to monastery buildings. The revival spread rapidly through the 1970s and 1980s as young men from across Europe and America discovered Mount Athos through word of mouth and travel guides. The population grew from 674 in 1963 to 1,200 by 1985, an increase of 78% in 22 years. The Great Lavra's population grew from 42 to 120, Vadapiti from 38 to 95, and St. Paul from 12 to 48. The new monks brought new skills including engineering, medicine, and technology that allowed the monasteries to modernize selectively while maintaining their ancient traditions. Some monasteries installed electricity and running water, while others rejected all modern technology and continued living as they had in the 10th century. The economic situation improved as donations from Western Orthodox donors increased dramatically. In 1980, the American Orthodox Church contributed $2 million to rebuild monastery infrastructure and fund new construction. The Greek government provided grants totaling 500 million drachmas for restoration of historical buildings and preservation of manuscripts. The monastery's annual income increased from 300,000 drachmas in 1950 to 50 million drachmas by 1985. The scriptoriums expanded, employing 20 monks who copied manuscripts for sale to collectors and museums across the world. The monasteries developed tourism revenue from male pilgrims, who paid fees to visit the peninsula, generating income of 10 million drachmas annually. By 1990, the monastic population had recovered to 1,500 monks, representing the highest number since the 19th century. The 20 major monasteries were fully occupied again, with waiting lists of young men seeking admission. The Holy Community voted to reopen 2 monasteries that had been closed for lack of population, restoring the number of voting institutions to 20. The peninsula's economy stabilized as donations, tourism, and manuscript sales provided sustainable income. The crisis had been averted, but the memory of near extinction remained fresh in the minds of elderly monks who had witnessed the abandonment and decay of the 1950s. The revival proved that Mount Athos could adapt to the modern world without losing its ancient identity. The monasteries maintained the female prohibition, the same governance structure, and the same liturgical traditions that had been established in 1045. But they also embraced selective modernization, including internet access for research, medical facilities for elderly monks, and selective use of electricity for heating and lighting. The spiritual revival had saved the peninsula from extinction, proving that ancient traditions could endure in the modern world if they offered something that the modern world could not provide. The monks had survived the Fourth Crusade, the Ottoman conquest, 2 world wars, and near extinction, and they would continue to endure for another 1,000 years. Today, 170 monks live across 20 monasteries on Mount Athos, maintaining the same governance structure unchanged for 1,600 years. The peninsula remains visa-free for Orthodox male pilgrims only, with women required to stay on the mainland and view the territory from boats that never reach the shore. The monasteries charge no taxes to the Greek state, operate their own courts, and continue to reject all modern technology in certain monasteries where electricity is forbidden and cars are not allowed. This is the last autonomous republic on earth, a place where time stands still, and where the charter signed by Emperor Constantine VII in 963 still holds legal force. The Holy Community convenes annually in the Prototon building at Karya's village, where 20 monks sit on stone seats arranged in a circle to vote on matters affecting the peninsula. The Protos is still elected for a 1-year term, still serves as the peninsula's representative to Greek authorities, still holds no power over individual monasteries. The elections are held on the first Monday of September, with voting conducted by secret ballot written on wax tablets just as they were in 1045. The building itself remains unchanged, its walls built from limestone blocks fitted together without mortar, its dome reaching 30 meters into the air and painted with frescoes depicting Christ Pantocrator, with eyes that follow every visitor. The female prohibition remains absolutely enforced with the same rigor as when Emperor Constantine IX codified it in 1045. No woman has ever been admitted, not even as a tourist, not even to die on its soil, not even in emergency. The Greek government respects the ban, and the European Union has recognized it as a unique religious exemption to gender equality laws. Armed monks guard the coastline at 3 fortified positions, turning away any boat carrying females before it can reach the harbor. In 2005, a woman disguised as a man managed to board a supply ship and was discovered 3 days later. She was immediately expelled, and the monk who had allowed her aboard was exiled to a remote skeet, where he spent the remaining 5 years of his life in silence. The monasteries maintain libraries containing 20,000 manuscripts, some dating to the 4th century and written on parchment that has survived 1,600 years. The Great Lavra Library holds 1,000 manuscripts, including works by Plato, Aristotle, and early Christian fathers that exist nowhere else on earth. The monastery's scriptorium employs 20 monks, who copy manuscripts for sale to collectors and museums across the world, generating income of 500,000 euros annually. The monastery archives contain the original charter from 963. Its ink faded, but its words clear. Its 3 imperial seals still visible in wax that has hardened to the consistency of stone. This document created a republic that has never obeyed any state in human history. The economic situation has stabilized with donations, tourism, and manuscript sales providing sustainable income for the monasteries. In 2020, the monastery's combined annual income totaled 10 million euros from various sources including pilgrim fees, icon sales, and olive oil production. The Great Lavra generates 2 million euros annually from land rents, fishing rights, and donations from wealthy Orthodox families across the world. The monasteries maintain hospitals with 20 beds for sick monks and guest houses that can accommodate 300 pilgrims. The peninsula employs 50 workers for maintenance, farming, and fishing, all of them male monks or lay brothers who have taken vows of celibacy. The spiritual life continues exactly as it has for 1,600 years, with vespers sung at sunset in the same chant from the 10th century. The monks pray for 12 hours daily, work for 6 hours in fields, gardens, and workshops, and sleep for 6 hours on wooden planks or stone floors. The refectories measure 30 meters long with wooden tables seating 12 people each, where monks eat bread, olives, and fish in silence while one brother reads from the Bible. The churches are painted with frescoes depicting Christ Pantocrator, the Virgin Mary, and saints arranged in hierarchies that have remained unchanged since the Byzantine Empire. The incense burns in censers made of silver and gold, filling the air with the same scent that filled the churches when Constantine the Great first legalized Christianity. The monasteries have selectively embraced modernization while maintaining their ancient traditions. Some monasteries now have internet access for research, medical facilities for elderly monks, and selective use of electricity for heating and lighting. But other monasteries reject all modern technology, living exactly as they did in the 10th century with candlelight, hand pumps, and no electricity whatsoever. This choice is left to each individual monastery, and both traditions coexist on the same peninsula without conflict. The holy community does not impose modernization or reject it, leaving each monastery free to decide its own relationship with the modern world. This flexibility has allowed Mount Athos to survive when other rigid institutions have crumbled. The Greek government maintains a civil governor stationed at Karias village who serves as the liaison between the state and the holy community. The governor has no authority over the monasteries, no power to enforce laws, and no role in the election of the protos. His office is located in a building constructed in 1926, specifically for this purpose, its walls painted white, and its windows overlooking the sea. The governor's role is purely ceremonial, serving as a symbolic acknowledgement that Mount Athos remains part of Greece, while simultaneously maintaining its autonomy. This arrangement has survived for 100 years without conflict, proving that autonomy and sovereignty can coexist when both sides respect the boundaries between them. The monastic population has stabilized at approximately 1,750 monks across all 20 monasteries, representing a recovery from the crisis of the 1950s when only 700 remained. The Great Lavra houses 120 monks, Vadapiti 95, St. Paul 48, and Iviron 110. The smallest monastery, Constamonitu, has 42 monks, enough to maintain its buildings and continue its traditions. The waiting lists for admission remain long, with young men from Greece, Russia, Romania, Serbia, America, and Western Europe seeking entry to the peninsula. The average age of monks is 45 years, with a healthy mix of young novices and elderly fathers who have spent 50 years in monastic life. Mount Athos remains what it has been for 1600 years, a fortress of celibacy, where men renounce the world to serve God alone, a republic where no woman has ever set foot, a place where time moves differently, and where the ancient chants still rise into the darkness at vespers. The charter from 963 still exists in the archives. The band still holds, absolute and unbroken for 11 centuries. The chants still sing in the same melody from the 10th century. The empire that created this republic has fallen. The sultan who confirmed its autonomy has been dead for 500 years. The nations that fought over it have risen and crumbled. But the monks remain. They have survived the Fourth Crusade, the Ottoman conquest, 2 world wars, the near extinction of the 1950s, and the modern world's assault on tradition. They will continue to endure, proving that some civilizations never fall. They simply outlast everything that tries to destroy them.